The dust of the high plains clung to Ilara like a second skin, a fine, gritty shroud that had been her constant companion since the day the rancher, Silas, had claimed her. She saw the world in shades of ochre and bruised violet, in the tremor of a distant storm, in the silent language of the wind whipping through the skeletal branches of an old cottonwood. Her ears, long since abandoned by sound, had sharpened her other senses to an unbearable keenness. She felt the vibrations of every approaching horse, the subtle shift in the floorboards as Silas passed, the restless thrum of the wives' anxieties that hummed beneath the surface of their enforced silence. He had purchased her not for a bride, nor for a servant in the traditional sense, but for a peculiar purpose whispered among the few who knew, a silent, unseeing guardian of his secrets perhaps, or merely another acquisition in a life built on absolute control. The vast, isolated ranch, a sprawling empire of sun-baked earth and imposing stone, felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage, its bars invisible but profoundly felt. The air was thick with unspoken rules, with the heavy weight of lives lived under a singular, unyielding will. She watched the wives, their faces etched with a weary resignation, their eyes holding stories they dared not tell, and in their guarded gazes, Ilara saw reflections of her own precarious existence, a shared vulnerability that transcended the barrier of sound. Her presence was tolerated, a quiet anomaly, a shadow among the shadows, yet her very muteness seemed to amplify the unspoken truths that pulsed through the ranch. It was a place where silence was not just a lack of sound, but a powerful, suffocating presence, a living entity that shaped every interaction, every breath drawn. She knew with the chilling certainty of one who perceives beyond the obvious that this grand, desolate landscape held more than just cattle and crops. It held a profound, unsettling secret, something that festered beneath the sun-baked earth, something that Silas fiercely protected, and something that had drawn her into its suffocating orbit. The quiet tension was a constant companion, a taut string vibrating just beyond the edge of perception, promising to snap at any moment, releasing whatever dread it held at bay. The ranch was a mausoleum of whispered hopes and buried dreams, and Ilara, in her profound stillness, was its most perceptive, albeit unwilling, archivist. Ilara's days unfolded in a rhythm dictated by the sun and Silas's inscrutable routine. She moved through the sprawling ranch house, a silent observer of the 6 women who also called it home. They were a study in varied forms of quiet despair. One, perpetually tending to a patch of wilting lavender by the kitchen door, her fingers gnarled, her eyes distant. Another, perpetually polishing already gleaming surfaces, her movements precise, almost robotic. A third, younger, her face often pressed against a window pane, gazing eastward as if waiting for a phantom ship. They rarely spoke to Ilara or to each other, their interactions limited to curt nods or shared, fleeting glances pregnant with unspoken histories. The common thread binding them was Silas, their shared master, husband, and warden. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, his presence a heavy weight in every room, even when he was absent. Ilara learned to read him through the subtle tightening of a jaw, the minute flicker in his dark eyes, the way the air seemed to thin around him. He was a man of few words, his commands delivered with a chilling economy that left no room for dissent or interpretation. His control extended beyond the ranch hands and the land. It permeated the very fabric of the women's lives, dictating their attire, their tasks, even the placement of their thoughts. Ilara found herself drawn to the youngest wife, a girl named Lyra, whose spirit, though heavily bruised, had not entirely broken. Lyra's eyes, often downcast, sometimes held a spark of defiance, a fleeting shadow of rebellion that Ilara, with her heightened senses, could almost feel. She saw Lyra trace patterns on dusty tabletops, patterns that seemed to form incomplete symbols, half-formed pleas that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The other wives seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, their personalities eroded by years of submission, leaving behind hollowed shells. They were a stark warning, a chilling glimpse into the future Silas might have intended for Ilara herself. Each woman was a testament to the rancher's vast, suffocating power, a power that seemed to seep from the very stones of the house, staining everything it touched with a peculiar, heavy silence. The shared quiet of the women was not peaceful. It was the quiet of a wound, festering beneath a tightly drawn bandage. The truth of how Alara came to be on Silas's ranch was a wound within a wound, a memory she carried not in sound, but in the phantom ache of a lost life. She saw it replayed in her mind's eye as a series of stark, muted images: the parched earth of her village, the dust storms that swallowed the horizon, the skeletal figures of her family, hollowed out by famine. Her deafness, a birthright, had often been seen as a curse, a burden in a world that demanded physical prowess. But when the emissaries of Silas arrived, seeking those with unique attributes for work on his expanding empire, her difference became her grim currency. Her father, a man broken by desperation, had looked at her with eyes full of a terrible love and an even more terrible defeat. The memory of his trembling hand releasing hers, of the raw, guttural cry that tore from his throat, but reached her only as a vibration in the ground, was a constant echo in the silence of her mind. Silas had offered a sum, a pittance for a human life, but enough to feed a starving family for a few months, enough to buy a fleeting reprieve from the specter of death that stalked their doorstep. He had looked at her, not with malice, but with a detached assessment, like one inspecting livestock. "She sees well," he had signed, his movements surprisingly precise, a detail that had both unsettled and intrigued her. He spoke of work, of shelter, of food, but his eyes, cold and assessing, spoke of ownership, of an unyielding claim. She remembered the arduous journey, the days of riding in the back of a creaking wagon, the vast empty plains stretching endlessly, swallowing her old life with each turn of the wheel. It was a journey into a new kind of silence, one not born of her ears, but of the desolate isolation of Silas's domain. She had arrived not as a guest, nor as a worker with a choice, but as a transaction, a piece of property, a girl traded for the mere promise of survival, for those she left behind. The memory was a bitter taste in her mouth, a constant reminder of the fine line between despair and sacrifice, and of the profound helplessness that had defined her transition from one existence to another. It was a debt paid not in coin, but in the quiet surrender of her very being. One blistering afternoon, as the sun hammered down on the tin roof of the sprawling barn, Alara witnessed a scene that sharpened the edges of her suspicion. Silas, usually composed, stood before a group of ranch hands, his face a storm of barely contained fury. He was shouting, though Alara could only perceive the violent contortions of his mouth, the bulging veins in his neck, the sudden aggressive gestures of his hands. The ranch hands, burly men accustomed to hardship, flinched under his tirade, their shoulders hunched, their eyes fixed on the ground. It was an explosion of raw, untamed power, a stark contrast to the quiet, controlled menace he usually projected. Then, one of the younger hands, a boy barely out of his teens, stumbled forward, clutching his arm. Alara saw a dark, blossoming stain on his sleeve. Silas, his face still contorted with rage, reached out not to help, but to shove the boy back, his movements brutal and dismissive. The boy fell, a silent crumple of limbs in the dust. The other hands froze, their fear palpable. It was a fleeting moment, gone as quickly as it appeared, but it solidified a truth Alara had only sensed. Silas's control was absolute, and his anger, when unleashed, was a terrifying force. Later that evening, she saw Silas in the main hall, his demeanor once again calm, almost serene, as he dictated orders to a scrawny ledger keeper. The ledger keeper, his face ashen, scribbled furiously, his hand trembling. The stark juxtaposition of the public tyrant and the composed patriarch was chilling. It was an act, Alara realized, a carefully constructed facade. He allowed no weakness, no dissent. This man, who had bought her as if she were a chattel, was not merely a strict master. He was a manipulator of immense skill, capable of shifting his emotional landscape with unnerving speed. The incident in the barn was a crack in that facade, a glimpse into the raw, untamed core of his being. It was a warning, stark and silent, that the delicate balance of power on this ranch was maintained by a brutal hand, and that any deviation from his will could have terrifying, irreparable consequences. The boy was gone the next day, a stark testament to the rancher's cruel, unwavering authority. The unsettling whispers began not as sound, but as visual disturbances, a subtle fraying of the rigid order Silas imposed. Ilara noticed the way Lyra, the youngest wife, would furtively exchange glances with the cook, an older woman with eyes that held the wisdom of many winters. These were not casual looks. They were charged with urgency, with a shared secret that pulsed beneath the surface of their mundane tasks. She saw Lyra leave small, almost invisible marks on the kitchen counter. A single feather, a stone placed in a specific way, a half-erased diagram in the dust. Ilara, with her heightened visual acuity, began to decipher these silent communications, piecing together fragments of a hidden language. One evening, after the rancher had retired to his study, Ilara observed a hushed gathering of the wives in the communal sitting room. Their bodies were tense, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and determination. Their hands moved, though not in the precise, controlled signs Silas sometimes used, but in gestures of urgency, of shared understanding that transcended formal language. Ilara watched, invisible in the shadows, as the woman who tended the lavender, normally so withdrawn, clenched her fists and pointed emphatically towards Silas's study. The other wives nodded, their expressions grim. Lyra, her eyes wide with a fragile terror, then made a gesture, a sweeping motion that seemed to encompass the entire house, then pointed to herself, her hand trembling. The cook responded with a reassuring nod, but her eyes held a profound sadness. It became clear to Ilara that the women were trapped, but also that they were planning, or at least yearning for, a way out. The truth began to solidify not as a single event, but as a tapestry woven from countless threads of oppression, desperation, and a simmering hidden resistance. The ranch, in Ilara's eyes, transformed from a simple place of confinement into a complex web of silent alliances and hidden terrors, each strand drawing tighter around the core mystery that lay at its heart. The whispers were not audible, but they resonated deeply within Ilara's observant mind, a silent chorus of suffering and desperate hope. The mystery deepened with the arrival of a stranger, a gaunt, secretive man who arrived under the cloak of night, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He spoke to Silas in hushed tones in the study, a conversation Ilara could only perceive through the subtle tremors of the floorboards and the muted glints of lamplight escaping under the door. What truly caught her attention, however, was Lyra's reaction. The young wife, normally subdued, became agitated, her movements jerky and her breathing shallow. Ilara saw Lyra attempt to approach the study door, only to be roughly intercepted by the polishing wife, who dragged her away with a desperate, silent urgency. The very air seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Later that week, Ilara, exploring the more remote parts of the ranch on one of her permitted solitary walks, discovered a small, hidden shed tucked away behind a thicket of scrub brush. It was unremarkable from the outside, but something compelled her to approach. The lock was old, rusted, and easily jimmied with a piece of wire she always carried. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of old wood and something else, something metallic and unsettling. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and what she saw sent a cold dread through her. Neatly stacked against one wall were dozens of small, crudely carved wooden dolls. Each one was unique, meticulously detailed, and each bore a disturbing resemblance to the women on the ranch. The lavender wife, the polishing wife, the cook, even Lyra. And then, at the very top of the pile, a new one, freshly carved, its features strikingly similar to Ilara herself. Her breath hitched. But it wasn't just the dolls. Beside them, on a dusty shelf, lay a collection of rusty tools, not farming implements, but surgical instruments, some of them stained with a dark, dried residue, and next to these, a tattered leather-bound journal. Ilara opened it, her fingers trembling. The pages were filled with Silas's precise, meticulous handwriting, not in words, but in anatomical drawings, diagrams of the human body, specifically focused on the inner ear, and strange, coded notations that looked like dates and cryptic symbols. A chill permeated her bones, colder than the desert night. The truth was not merely about control. It was about something far more sinister, something that preyed on the very essence of the women he held captive. The shed, once a place of mundane storage, became a horrifying archive, a silent testament to a madness meticulously hidden. The discovery in the shed ripped through Ilara's carefully constructed world. The dolls, the instruments, the chilling journal, it all painted a picture far more grotesque than she could have imagined. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, soundless drum. She understood now why Lyra was so agitated by the stranger, why the wives moved with such a profound, deep-seated terror. Silas wasn't just a rancher, he was a collector, a morbid artist, and his canvases were human lives. She reread the chilling anatomical diagrams, her fingers tracing the delicate structures of the inner ear, the small, almost imperceptible notations alongside them. Each cryptic symbol, each date, suddenly seemed to correspond with the arrival or departure of a wife, or perhaps a victim. A terrifying realization dawned. Silas was experimenting. He was trying to fix them, to fix their perceived imperfections, their deafness to his absolute authority, perhaps even their literal hearing. The tools, the strange man, it all clicked into a horrific mosaic. He bought women, not just to control them, but to transform them, to excise their will, or some part of their physical being, to suit his twisted vision of perfection. The previous wives, the ones before the current 6, where were they? Had they failed his treatments? Had they succumbed to his monstrous ambition? The silence of the ranch suddenly felt less like a protective barrier and more like a tomb, designed to bury the screams and the secrets. Ilara knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that her own doll, freshly carved, marked her as his next subject. Her very existence, her profound deafness, made her the ultimate specimen for his depraved experiments. The tension, which had been a slow, simmering pot, now boiled over into a cold, paralyzing dread. She had to act. The knowledge was a crushing weight, but also a terrifying catalyst. She had seen the truth, felt it in the tremor of her own body. The path ahead was perilous, fraught with unimaginable danger, but to do nothing was to surrender to a fate worse than death itself, to become another silent, lifeless doll in Silas's macabre collection. The ranch, once merely a prison, now revealed itself as a living, breathing laboratory of human suffering. The truth, when it finally resonated through her, was not a sound, but a cold, visceral shock that vibrated through every bone in Ilara's body. It came not from a single word, but from a mosaic of observed horrors. She had returned to the hidden shed under the cover of a moonless night, compelled by an urgent, terrifying certainty. This time she wasn't alone. Lyra, her face pale and streaked with tears, was already there, clutching a small, tarnished locket. The locket, when opened, revealed a faded photograph of a young girl with bright, defiant eyes, a girl startlingly similar to Lyra herself, but with a vibrancy that Lyra now utterly lacked. Lyra signed, her hands shaking so violently Ilara could barely follow. But the meaning was clear, conveyed not just through the movements but through the raw despair in Lyra's eyes, the choking sobs that racked her slender frame. "My sister," Lyra signed, pointing to the photograph, then to one of the older, most meticulously carved dolls in Silas's collection. He tried to fix her. He said he could make her strong. He broke her." Lyra then gestured wildly, desperately, towards the rusty surgical tools, towards the chilling anatomical diagrams in the journal, towards her own throat, her eyes wide with terror. The implication was horrific, unspeakable. Silas was not just performing experiments. He was mutilating, silencing, erasing the women who resisted him, transforming them into the compliant, vacant figures Ilara saw daily. Her own deafness, the very reason Silas had acquired her, was merely another defect he intended to cure through his depraved methods. The true horror wasn't just the physical mutilation, but the spiritual vivisection, the deliberate breaking of a human spirit. Ilara's mind reeled. The silent cries of the past victims, unheard by her ears, now echoed with searing clarity in her very soul. This was the truth she had finally heard, a truth of systematic cruelty, of lives extinguished, not by death, but by a monstrous, calculated act of will-breaking. The raw, emotional intensity of Lyra's confession, delivered without a single sound, struck Ilara with more force than any scream. It was the truth of her own impending doom, a truth that demanded action, a truth that ignited a desperate, burning fire within her. The revelation left Ilara hollowed out, yet paradoxically, filled with a cold, desperate resolve. The initial shock gave way to a surge of adrenaline, a raw, protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. She looked at Lyra, her face a mask of grief and terror, and in that moment, a bond forged in shared suffering cemented between them. The hope of escape, once a vague, distant shimmer, now crystallized into a tangible, if perilous, plan. They had to leave, and they had to expose Silas, to break the suffocating silence that had swallowed so many lives. The memory of her family, of the desperate sacrifice her father had made, flared within her, propelling her forward. She would not be another doll. She would not become another silent monument to Silas's depravity. The weight of the other wives' unspoken pain pressed upon her, a silent chorus urging her to action. She knew the ranch, its hidden passages, its desolate expanses, its rhythms. Her deafness, once a vulnerability, now became an unexpected asset. She could move through the night like a ghost, relying on vibrations, on visual cues, on the subtle currents of air. The thought of confronting Silas, of escaping his pervasive grasp, was terrifying, but the alternative was far worse. Lyra, though fragile, possessed a fierce inner resilience, and her knowledge of the house, of Silas's habits, was invaluable. Together they might have a chance, a slim, improbable flicker of hope against the overwhelming darkness. The emotional storm within Ilara was a tempest of fear, rage, and a burgeoning sense of defiant purpose. She had been bought, used, and marked for a horrific fate, but the truth had awakened something fierce within her. She was no longer just the deaf girl. She was a witness, an avenger, a conduit for the silent screams of those who had come before her. The path to freedom would be a brutal gauntlet, but the fire of indignation now burned too brightly within her to be extinguished. Their escape began under the cloak of a moonless night, a silent, tense ballet of shadow and breath. Ilara moved first, a wraith through the familiar halls, her every muscle attuned to the vibrations of the sleeping house. Lyra followed, her movements hesitant but resolute, her hand clutched tightly in Ilara's. They bypassed the creaking floorboards, avoided the telltale drafts that would betray an open door, their shared fear a silent guide. They knew Silas would be in his study, immersed in his macabre journals, or perhaps even in the hidden shed preparing for his next heinous act. Their objective was not just escape, but revelation. They gathered the incriminating evidence from the shed, the journal, the tools, the doll that resembled Ilara, a chilling testament to his designs. Each item was a heavy stone of truth. As they slipped through a seldom-used pantry window, the cool night air was a shock against their skin, a taste of a freedom they desperately craved. The ranch stretched out before them, vast and imposing, but for the first time, it didn't feel like an inescapable prison. They moved with urgency across the dry earth, the distant howl of a coyote echoing their own desperate cries for deliverance. They found the main road, a faint ribbon in the darkness, and began their arduous journey away from Silas's insidious domain. They were two figures against an immense, unforgiving landscape, vulnerable, yet armed with a truth so damning it could shatter an empire. The image of the other wives, trapped and silent, was a constant spur. Ilara looked back just once at the distant lights of the ranch, a silent, defiant farewell to the horrors she left behind. The journey was long, grueling, but with each step, the suffocating grip of Silas's control loosened, replaced by the faint, exhilarating stirrings of hope. The resolution was not immediate, not a sudden burst of sunlight, but a slow, arduous crawl towards a new dawn, propelled by the very truth that had almost consumed them. The journey was long, marked by hunger and thirst, by the constant phantom threat of pursuit, but with each passing mile the ranch became a smaller, less tangible horror in their minds. They eventually found their way to a distant town, a cluster of buildings that seemed impossibly bustling after the ranch's desolate quiet. Here they found cautious allies in people who saw not their vulnerability, but their courage, people who had perhaps heard hushed rumors of Silas's strange ways, but had lacked the proof or the will to challenge him. The journal, the dolls, the surgical tools. These tangible pieces of evidence were their voices, speaking a truth more damning than any sound. The authorities, initially skeptical, could not ignore the chilling implications of Silas's meticulous records. The revelation sent shockwaves through the quiet, insular community. The grotesque reality of Silas's experiments was laid bare, and the stories of the missing women, long dismissed as runaways or unfortunate accidents, suddenly gained a horrifying context. Justice, slow and methodical, began its arduous course. Ilara and Lyra, though survivors, carried the indelible scars of their ordeal. The world, even freed from Silas's direct tyranny, remained a place of complex shadows and lingering anxieties. But they were no longer silent. Ilara, though still deaf to sound, had found her voice through the truth she uncovered, a voice that spoke with a resonant power no one could ignore. She spoke not in words, but through her unwavering testimony, through the quiet strength of her survival, through the unwavering gaze that had seen beyond the surface. The other wives, those who remained, were finally freed, their broken spirits beginning the slow, painful process of healing. The ranch, once a place of unspeakable horror, stood as a monument to a dark chapter, but also, in time, as a symbol of liberation. Hope was not a sudden burst of light, but a tender, persistent shoot pushing through cracked earth. It was the quiet knowing that even in the deepest silence, truth could reverberate, and even in the most profound darkness, a glimmer of justice could finally be seen. Ilara had heard the truth, and in doing so, she had found her own profound, unwavering voice in a world that had tried so desperately to silence her.